Hello? My name is Frank Sisson. I'm director of the Peter Jacek Center for Ukrainian Historical Research at the University of Alberta. Is this on? No. Yes? Okay. Let us see. All right, that's better? Yes, a little further and this is better yet, okay? Okay, you can hear me. I welcome you this evening. This is the 18th annual Holodomor or Ukrainian Famine lecture in Toronto. Though we have had no one challenge it, I say yearly that this is the oldest continuous series on the Ukrainian famine anywhere. It occurs because a number of organizations cooperate every year on this. It was begun by the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Alberta and the Center for East European and Russian Studies at the University of Toronto at the request of the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress Committee of Toronto. Obviously, they pay me to remember all these names in order, so we'll see how I do on it. And that was in 1998. The first lecturer was Dr. James Mace. Dr. Mace was a pioneer in studying the famine in Ukraine. He assisted Robert Conquest in the writing of the book Harvest of Sorrow. And later, after he moved to Ukraine, where he was active in promoting studies of the Ukrainian famine in Ukraine. Through the years, many other institutions have joined in sponsoring this event. At the now serious Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the Munk Center, and the name was changed, obviously, with the political changes in Eastern Europe. The Petro Jacek Program for the Study of Ukraine was formed, and it as well became a sponsor. We were then later joined by the St. Vladimir Institute over on Spadina. That's where those of you who see the statue when you go down Spadina. And the Ukrainian-Canadian Research and Documentation Center, which is housed at that institute. We are more recently joined by the Chair of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Toronto, and we thank all those organizations who cooperate. We also thank those who assist us in funding, and that is particularly the Canadian Foundation for Ukrainian Studies, CFUS, which for the past few years has cooperated in this. In 2013, a new institution, the Holodomor Research and Educational Consortium, was formed at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies of the University of Alberta. You'll be tested, by the way, on all these names when you leave. This institution was founded by a very generous support from the Temerté Family Foundation, from Louise and Jim Temerté, and we are grateful to them. Our project is now this consortium is now in its third year. The grant has been renewed for another 2 years, and we hope that we will someday be able to change the C to a center for the study of the Holodomor. Due to the generous support of that foundation, we've been able to be much more active and have sponsored in the past 3 years major conferences dealing with the Holodomor. So in 2013, which was the 80th anniversary of the Holodomor, we did a conference calling Contextualizing the Holodomor, the Impact of 30 Years of Ukrainian Studies. This conference attempted to say, well, when one studies the Ukrainian famine, then what is it meant not only for study of the famine itself, but for subjects such as the study of Ukrainian history, Soviet history, genocide studies. And we invited a number of scholars to speak on that. We first put this out online, as one does today, in our Institute journal, the Journal for East-West Studies, Journal of Ukrainian Studies and East-West Studies. And we now have put this out in print form, the form that I still prefer to use, and I hope many still do. This conference is called Contextualizing the Holodomor, this volume. You have contributions from very noted scholars, including Norman Neymark, a major scholar on genocide, Andrea Graziosi, a specialist on Soviet history, a number of other very prominent specialists. It is really a wonderful volume, and you may purchase this volume, those of you who didn't on your way in, but certainly afterwards, and I think it will give you a lot of thought and material on this. We last year sponsored a conference comparing famines in communist countries in China, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. That was really very interesting for all of us to realize that although we long said that the Holodomor is an understudied event, we found out that there are more understudied events. That is that perhaps 45 million people died in a famine in China, which is only beginning to be studied, and in which, of course, the Chinese government has little interest to this day in this study. Or that the Kazakh famine, which wiped out a quarter of the Kazakh population, occurred without leaving any oral testimony, any survivor testimony. We can't study it through those who lived through it. And so we began to see that the study of the Holodomor now can offer some of its experience to the study of the other events. And a week and a half ago, perhaps, but it seems longer ago at the moment, we did a conference on starvation as a political tool. And we went back in history to the Irish famine of the 19th century. There is a great dispute whether this was a genocide or not, lest we think that these disputes are ever resolved quickly. They go on for a very long time. We dealt with the Armenian genocide of 1915. And also discussed genocide in Sudan in the Nuba Mountains, and tried to do this across continents and across centuries as a way of studying it. We look forward to new conferences dealing with issues such as Stalinism and Soviet history, and we hope you will look out for these and attend them. Now, I said that I still prefer print, as much of us do, and we are glad we can have this Contextualizing the Holodomor because of a generous donation of the Ignatovich Family Foundation and of Ian Ignatovich and Martha Witter, and we're grateful to them for making it possible to put it out in this form as well. So these are the general description of this lecture and its origin and its continuation. Every year we get a stellar speaker, and then people come to me and say, yeah, but you still got a better one this year. This year, I think are particularly privileged to have Professor Timothy Snyder as our lecturer. Professor Snyder has a BA in European History and Political Science from Brown University, a DPhil from Oxford University, and was an Academy Scholar at Harvard University. He is presently Hussman Professor of History at Yale University. His publications are myriad and in many fields, but I think most impressive, when I look at the list, is that his major languages of research are German, French, Polish, Russian, Ukrainian, Czech, Slovak, Belarusian, Yiddish, and Spanish, and he didn't give me the minor languages of research, which I would like to have the list of later. Now, I view this as particularly important because we live in a world today of linguistic tyranny of the English language. It is getting harder and harder to convince our graduate students that however useful English may be for email or whatever mails, Facebooks and whatever communications, it is not the be-all and end-all of research. And that mastering one language is not such a great accomplishment if they wish to be historians or political scientists. And so to have the example of an accomplished historian of the younger generation who has taken the time, effort, and of course has great ability to master languages, deal with them in research, I think bodes well for the future of historical studies. His many publications begin with a study of nationalism, Marxism, and modern Central Europe, a study of Kazimierz Keles Kraus, 1872 to 1905. I'm sure a figure known to all of you here. But what it shows is that one begins by deep study of specific figures of the past, important in Polish history, but important as well, published by the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard. He went on from this study to a really innovative study, I believe, called the Reconstruction of Nations, 1569 to 1999. Mark those dates. Too many historians, particularly those who study the end of the 20th century, don't really want to know what happened before the Second World War and now have been dragged into the study of the First World War, but don't want to go further. What this book does is it argues that if one wants to understand national communities, one must look back to the early modern period. Therefore, it caused much discussion and thought by people in the field. In this case, about a region of the world about which all too many, I think, knew too little. He then went on to a much more focused study, Sketches from a Secret War, a Polish Artist's Mission to Liberate Soviet Ukraine. A great title, but it also deals with a very important period in Polish history and Polish-Ukrainian relations when there were attempts in interwar Poland to reverse a policy of rather forced Polonization of Ukrainians and to, in the line of a certain element of the politics of Polish federalism in Pilsudski, look at Ukraine as a potential partner, and indeed even the Ukrainians of Poland as a group to which civil liberties should be given. And by the way, these are all books, of course. I don't even go near articles for this list. Then he turned to a topic beloved in Ukrainian mythology and among Habsburg nostalgists. That is, he turned to the topic of the embroidered Willhelm, or what we call Vasil Vyshevany, a Habsburg prince who decided that his Ruthenian or Ukrainian subjects were worthy of interest, and therefore he would find a way to carve a new Ukrainian state as the world was changing and the Habsburg world was changing at the end of the First World War and the events thereafter. It is a very important figure, and it also was a book that reached a whole new public with all kinds of new discussions that dealt with the person, of sexuality, of issues that Eastern Europeans don't always like to touch or discuss, I might say. And for those of you, by the way, since I'm plugging books today, who want to know more about this period and this figure, one, get Professor Snyder's book. It is not here today, but our institute has just published a very important book of scholars on Ukraine 1917-21 that I much recommend to you for those of you who want to know about this period. And then the books that most of you know, Bloodlines, a book which discussed the territories between Germany and Russia that dealt with why the years of 1933 to the end of the Second World War caused such a massive loss of life, beginning with the Ukrainian famine and going through events through World War II and dealing with the two totalitarian systems that caused so much suffering in Eastern Europe. I might add that many of his books have been translated, but by the time I get up this far up the list, we find a book that's been translated into 25 languages. So it is a book in which a world community beyond those who only read English or prefer English have had access to this book, and it has caused many scholars to rethink Eastern Europe. He has published essays on the 20th century, thinking the 20th century, together with discussing with Tony Jude, a major historian, regrettably deceased too early. This is a book you may get in the back afterwards and get signed later, so please go up and purchase this book of scintillating essays. And he has just come out with a book on Black Earth, a new interpretation of World War II and the Holocaust and the events of Eastern Europe. That book is available for you today, and we hope that many of you will leave with it when you leave this hall. Now, this too long introduction, I will end with saying he is a very good lecturer. And of his many memorable lectures which I've heard. Perhaps the most was in the city of Lviv, or Lviv, Lviv as we would say it, in Western Ukraine. I was there during the book forum in 2014. It's a wonderful event of people who still respect books and line up to buy these books. We love the world to go to it. He was going to speak at a very crucial moment. That is, this was almost a little less than a year since the beginning of the Maidan, and everything had changed in Ukraine, and a large number of young people. It's a city of students wanted to hear him. The venue had to be changed to the largest hall they could find at the Drahomanov Library, entirely filled with young people. For me, it was a very pleasant moment because although they had simultaneous translations available, I could see a good half of the students in Western Ukraine no longer need translations to English. They have learned Western languages, which is very positive. But they were in what I would almost call an agitated state or a state of anxiety after what had gone through from the Maidan, from the Russian invasion and seizure of Crimea, from the wars that are breaking out. This was a time of great worry in Ukraine, but it was also a time of potential disillusionment. Disillusionment with what they saw as the values of the West and the countries who had perhaps easily, in words, encouraged them to want to have democracy and independence, but were not as likely to help them in this. I mean, it's a bit, I would think, almost reminiscent of what Czechoslovak students must have felt in 1938 or Hungarian students in 1956. You know, these are patterns, varying different situations, different degrees of wars and hybrid wars and information wars, but certainly that. And they wanted a voice on it. And it was a wonderful lecture because it was a lecture of a historian well-versed in history who could tell them where Ukraine fit in larger historical problems and issues, yet could also deal with their problems, and who could forthrightly discuss these issues and engage them, and also give them, I thought, a good voice to say that these problems don't get resolved in a day, but there is a European community, there are democratic values, there are things worth striving for, that that gives certain still values left into historical experience. He much values teaching. Tomorrow he'll be meeting with our graduate students, 20, 24, I don't know how many are going to, we hope, arrive at breakfast, and I think they will arrive for breakfast for him, and shows that he takes the time to educate the next generation, and that is what I find so positive. So I would ask you to please join me in greeting Professor Timothy Snyder.
Thank you very much, Frank. The problem with kind introductions of this sort is that you settle back into your seat and you think, oh, what a lovely man, I hope to meet him someday. You know? and then you realize, oh yes, now it's my job to stand up and be that person. In this case, I'd like to start with two thank yous. The first is to Frank for this kind word, and especially since Professor Sisson and others here, like Professor Magrushi, are the people who I read when I was trying to become a Ukrainian historian. So it's a special pleasure to be able to speak in their presence. I'd also like to thank those from the Ukrainian community who are here today. What you are commemorating, and it's a privilege to be able to take part in your commemoration. There's a difference, of course, between history and memory, and I'm honored, and it's a pleasure for me that you choose to commemorate by way of history. What a historian can offer is an attempt at understanding. So what I would like to try to do in the next 45 minutes or so is I would like to make a case for the Ukrainian famine as an event in world history. So in a way, what I'll be doing is reversing the frame, a bit in the way that Frank already suggested in his introduction. Rather than looking at the Holodomor as an event in Ukrainian history, which of course it indisputably is, and I'd be very happy to talk about that or answer questions about it as we move along in our meeting here today. What I would like to do instead is to see how it looks from the outside. That is, to consider what it might mean in the broader framework. broader, yeah, there we go. In the broader frameworks of European or of world history, or to put it in a more radical way, people often ask me, why do you write about Ukrainian things since you're not Ukrainian? In fact, there's several people in this room who have asked me that question. Yes, lots of guilty laughter. And then there's the related question, why do you write about the Holocaust if you're not Jewish? Or why do you write about the Polish, why do you write about Polish things if you're not Polish, right? I get this question from so many angles that my actual identity has become very obscure, which is how I would like it to remain. So any secrets that you may know, please don't share them. But there's an answer to this question. And the answer to this question is that I believe that the history of this region actually helps us to understand the history of Europe as a whole. And indeed, I'm going to try to make the case, it helps us understand the history of the world as a whole. In other words, I don't just see East European history or Ukrainian history as a kind of missing piece that has to be plugged in. I don't think that what we need to be doing is writing compensatory histories where we say, well, in France they have croissants and in Ukraine we have suffering. I think what we need to be doing instead is making the case that the things that don't make sense in European history start to make sense if you put Ukraine or Eastern Europe back in. And what I want to try to do today is press that case forward and say, big events in world history start to make sense, start to line up before our eyes, in our minds, if we put Ukrainian history into the picture. Okay, that's a big claim. Let me now try to defend it. Let me start with events that are familiar in European history, because the way I'd like the argument to progress, I want to first establish that major events in European history actually make more sense with Ukraine. Then I'm going to move on to a closer examination of the 1930s and the famine itself, and then I will conclude with some remarks about Ukraine and Europe today. The basic theme will be at all three moments in European history, in the history of the first globalization, I'm going to call it the 19th and 20th centuries, and in the history of the second globalization, which is a fancy way of saying today. In all three moments, Ukraine is central to helping us understand. Okay, the European case, that's the easiest case to make. If one looks at all of the classical moments in European history, they make more sense with Ukraine present. And indeed, the Ukrainian present makes them not only more coherent, but also more interesting. So one way to start European history is with the Christian conversions. And by the way, this is going to be the medieval and early modern part of the lecture, so Bob and Frank, if you want to, not pay attention for a while, that'd be fine with me. No, because although Frank said very nice things about the Reconstruction of nations, right? I'm a modern historian, so there might be a certain amount of free play going on. Feel free to see if Frank is nodding or shaking his head as I speak, right? So if one looks at, for example, the Christian conversions, this is a universal moment in European history. If one looks at Ukraine, one sees some interesting things, some interesting possibilities. You have Scandinavian settlement, i.e. Vikings, as you have in other places. You have Khazars, which you do not have in other places. You have Khazars possibly converting to many things, who knows what. You have the formation of a state around Rus, which comes from elements from Scandinavia, elements from the Turkic world, finally becoming, as it's established as a civilization, what we call Rus or Ruthenia. This is Christian conversion, but it's much more interesting, let's face it, than like some Irish bishops building, tall churches. It's much more interesting than the conversion of Wales or France or Germany. It's much more complicated, much more interesting. Likewise, the classic European theme, maybe the classic European theme of the encounter of settled civilizations with nomads, right? This is what you know as the collapse of Rus and the arrival of the Mongols. The Mongols come, it's at a moment of fragility for Rus. Rus comes apart. This is the moment where Asian history makes contact with European history. Ukraine is right in the middle of it. But what one has here is actually the big theme. Can you defend settled civilization against nomads? And what follows from this is another classical moment of European and perhaps world history, which is, can you codify law? So for me, the most interesting thing about Rus is how it lives on after its death, right? Which is by way of the codification of law. In the Anglo-Saxon tradition, right, which I'm going to include, all of us in, this is going to be my North American moment with y'all, although I just said y'all. In the Anglo-Saxon tradition, we talk about England, right, and the Magna Charta, and in claims that nobles make against kings, and the codification of law. The codification of law in Rus, in Chancery Slavonic, then becomes the court law and the court language of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which is the largest state in medieval Europe at the time. In other words, the civilizational package of law and language of Rus goes on for centuries and centuries and centuries, right? That is part of European history, the codification of law, and this is the East European version. The Renaissance, also much more interesting in Ukraine than it is in other places, especially in its Baroque version. The Baroque curriculum, which is established at the Kyiv Mohyla Academy, is fascinating. The use of Latin and Polish, and in particular, thinking of the Renaissance as something that arrives in a place where there never was a naissance, right? Like, I mean, in America, lots of people know that you can be born again. That's one of our specialties. But the idea of being born again without being born, I find particular, like that you can have a renaissance without a naissance in the first place. That Renaissance culture can spread so many, 1,000 kilometers beyond where Rome actually got. This is not trivial, right? That Kyiv could become a site precisely of the revival and the transformation of classical learning is extremely interesting, and no history of the Renaissance is complete without it. Or the Reformation, right, which is interesting enough in its German version or its Swiss version, but when it comes to Ukraine or when it comes to the lands of Old Rus, including Belarus, involves, and this is a history which Frank has told in many versions very well, involves the encounter of Protestants and Catholics with the Orthodox. It also involves this attempt to bring together Eastern and Western Christianity. It's much more complicated and also much more interesting. Jesuits polemicizing not only against Protestants but against the Orthodox is extremely interesting, right? The Orthodox taking arguments from the Protestants and using them against the Catholics is very interesting. And not to mention Orthodox and Jews collaborating to translate Bibles. These are things which don't happen in Western Europe, and the history of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation becomes much more interesting if you put them together. Finally, and this is where I'm going to make my little transition to the modern world, the age of exploration. When we think of the age of exploration, we quite rightly think about boats and the high seas. We think of the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Dutch, and later the English. We think of North America, South America. We think of Asia, later Africa, and this is all quite proper. But there is also an age of exploration going on quite literally at the same time, which involves land. That is the age of exploration of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. That is the movement of Poles and Polish customs and religion and language eastwards into Belarus and especially into Ukraine, especially after the Union of Lublin of 1569. And this is literally exploration because Polish scholars and missionaries and travelers are making atlases and writing books in which they are debunking what the Greeks thought about the classical world. Because the Greeks, of course, placed, Hyperborea and all these things that didn't really exist, griffins, mountains of gold, right? They don't really exist, by the way. I realize you're an educated audience, so I don't have to spend a lot of time on this. No griffins, no mountains of gold, never happened. The Greeks placed all of these things just beyond the classical world, right? In other words, in Ukraine, what's now Ukraine, Russia, Belarus. And the Polish explorers would then write books about how this was not, in fact, the case. This is also an age of exploration. It's just an age of exploration that happens across land, right? And this is where I wanted to take us. I wanted to take us to the first globalization. What I want to consider, and this is the main argument that I want to make, what I want to consider is where Ukraine fits into a world that becomes globalized. Now, you may not see how this comes to the famine, but trust me, it's going to come to the famine. It's all going to make sense. Where does Ukraine fit in a world that has been globalized? This is my main question, and it's going to lead us to the famine in a way that's perhaps unexpected, but I hope in a way that's going to make sense to all of us. Where does Ukraine fit in a world of empire? So the first globalization, the globalization that's complete by the 19th century, is a globalization of empire. One has to imagine, and this is a very important point, and in a way it reflects some of Frank's remarks, what we have to imagine that this condition that we have now, globalization, that it's the only thing new about it is the screens, right? The fact that we spend a lot of time staring at screens, I admit that's new, but the condition of globalization itself, in terms of movement of people and capital, the idea that there was one planet, that one has to have planetary solutions, planetary arguments, planetary ideologies, that is not new, right? That was all there in the 19th century. So what I want to ask is, so I'm jumping forward from the age of exploration to imperialism, forgive me, I don't have that much time. But what I want to ask is, in a world which is already covered by empire, what role does Ukraine play and how is Ukraine important? And I think the answer is that actually it reveals a key to that world. Okay, what do I mean? When we talk about world history, the main way we talk about world history is in terms of colonization and decolonization. And in general, the case that is made is that the Europeans are the colonizers, okay, so, which is naughty, and that everyone else are the decolonizers, yay. Okay, that's generally how it works. What I want to suggest, you can do it the other way. You can say colonization, yay, decolonization, bad, depending on your politics, right? You can have it both ways. I'm taking, given the recent elections, it's colonization bad, decolonization good, but you can correct me. But you can take it either way. But the point is that we organize it in terms of two parties. There's Europe and the rest of the world. Europe colonizes, everybody else decolonizes, and then we make judgments about that. Or to be cynical about it, there are white people and there are not white people. What I want to suggest is that this actually is wrong. What I want to suggest is that although it makes sense to see the world in imperial terms, in the first globalization as imperial, decolonization actually starts in Europe itself. We give it a different name. We call it national movements. But decolonization starts in Europe itself. It starts in Greece. It starts in Serbia. And the movements against the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, which we call national movements, which is that's how Europeans talk about other Europeans, right? They don't say anti-colonial, they say national. It's a kind of little intra-European privileging that we do. So the first decolonial movements are against empires in Europe itself. The thing that we call national movements, the building of national states, Greece, Serbia, later Romania, Bulgaria in the 19th century, that's where the nation state starts, really. The Serbian model is much purer than the French model because the French have all these universal ideas, right? They claim that they're bringing enlightenment to everyone else. The Serbs, whatever you think of the Serbs, they do not claim to be bringing enlightenment to everyone else, right? That is not their pitch. Their pitch is there's Serbia, there's Serbs, there's Serbian territory, there's a Serbian economy. It's a much purer model of the nation state. What I'm trying to say is that that model of the nation state, so familiar to us now, is the beginning of the end of empire. That's how the first globalization starts to come to an end. And it's a process which spreads out from the Balkans into Central Europe, Italy, Italian unification, German unification. It's a process which seems perfectly normal to us, but we just look at it in European terms, right? We think, oh yes, the Greeks, they had to have independence because they have columns, they have Doric columns. And the Germans had to have independence because they have Goethe and so on. That's a very European way of looking at it. The global way of looking at it is to say that this is the beginning of decolonization. Now, why am I insisting on this so much? The reason that I want to insist on this so much is because we get to a moment, and that moment is 1914 to 1918, the First World War. We get to a moment when this globalization collapses. And it collapses in a particular way. It collapses with the spread of nation states. So Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, the Baltic states, where you didn't have nation states in Europe, suddenly you have nation states. Now, from a European point of view, you might say, oh, that's normal, that's natural, there are nation states. We were always going to have nation states. If you look at it more broadly from the point of view of global history, you could say, well, actually, the history of the nation state is very short. It's so short that it almost didn't happen. And the notion that it had to happen and then it's going to last forever is a kind of European teleology. It's not actually the case. And Ukraine is a way of drawing attention to this general fact. Okay, what do I mean? There was I don't have to tell you this, there was a Ukrainian national movement. It's certainly comparable to the Balkan national movements or other Central European national movements in terms of the number of adherents, the quality of poetry, however you want to measure it. And if you want to measure it in terms of how many people died fighting for independence, certainly the Ukrainian national movement takes many more mortal casualties than almost any other movement for national independence during and after the First World War, right? So by that, if you like objective criterion, there's certainly a national movement there. What's unusual about Ukraine, and again, you all know this, but I'm going to make the point for slightly different reasons. What's unusual is that there's not a Ukrainian nation state, right? There's not a state. There isn't a Ukrainian state like there's going to be a Polish one or a Czechoslovak one, like there already is a Hungarian one or a Romanian one. And this leads us into where I want to go. Okay, so I don't want to talk about the Soviet Union as oppressing its nationalities yet. I'm going to get to that. I realize that's the most familiar meme. We could now talk about how the Soviet Union was bad for its nationalities. Okay, it was. But there's something more fundamental that we have to say from a world historical point of view. The Soviet Union was not about nationalities. The Soviet Union was about a vision of global history. It was about how you globalize after the first globalization is over, right? So you'll have to forgive me if it seems like I'm saying a bunch of nice things about the Soviet Union. I don't mean for them to be nice. Like, I realize this is the part in the lecture where, like, I should be saying bad things about the Soviet Union. That will come, but what I'm aiming for now is understanding, right? What I'm aiming for is understanding. If you look at the Soviet Union, what you see is not an attempt to build a state. What you see is a kind of counter-globalization. The point of the Soviet Union is that imperialism is over, and we're going to build some kind of rival model on a world scale. The Soviet Union was not supposed to exist as a state. It was supposed to exist as a revolution. When it comes to exist as a state, which is the failure, right? That's the failure of the revolution. When the revolution doesn't spread to Poland, Germany, France, Britain, then the Soviet Union has to exist as a state. And when the Soviet Union has to exist as a state, then it needs a model of development, okay? And you see where I'm going with this. The model of development is what Stalin himself calls internal colonization, right? So Stalin says, I'm quoting Stalin, Stalin says, "We do not have far-flung maritime empires like the British and the French. Therefore, we must colonize ourselves." Now, what does colonizing ourselves mean in practice? What colonizing ourselves means in practice is the sacrifice of the countryside to the city. What colonizing ourselves means in practice is attempting to make all of capitalist history happen over the course of a 5-year plan, the first 5-year plan of 1928 to 1933. What internal colonization means in particular is taking the agriculturally richest parts of the Soviet Union, Ukraine, not only Ukraine, but among other places Ukraine, and expecting that they will be the breadbasket for the cities, for the mines, for the factories. When this doesn't work, and this is a story that you all know very well, when this doesn't work, the blame is going to be assigned nationally. Now, this is where I think things get extremely interesting, because when you ask the question, how is the Ukrainian famine a national event? Okay, it's a national event because it happened inside the borders of Soviet Ukraine, and because you remember it as a national event. But it wasn't a national event because Ukrainians behaved nationally, right? Ukrainians resisted collectivization to some extent, but it was a national event because the Soviet Union, or the leadership of the Soviet Union, presented it nationally. The failure of requisitions in 1930 had nothing to do with the Ukrainian nation. The argument for punishing people inside the Soviet Ukraine had very much to do with the Ukrainian nation. That is to say, Stalin, Kaganovich, the Politburo in general, or what Stalin called our leading group inside the Politburo, nationalized the event. The event was the general failure of collectivization. They nationalized the event, blamed Ukrainians in particular for it, and therefore you get the blacklists, therefore you get the closing of the Ukrainian-Soviet borders, therefore you get the ban on Ukrainian peasants traveling from countryside to city and so on. Therefore you get all of the specific policies from October of 1932 through February of 1933, which lead to at least 3 million completely unnecessary deaths. So the point of all of this, you see the point, it's a national event in its outcome, right? It's understandably remembered as a national event, but it is the result of an attempt to remake the world. Now, what's particularly interesting and tragic about Ukraine is that this is not true once, it's true twice. So when Hitler looks at the famine in Soviet Ukraine, as he does in early 1933, he is running for office. In February of 1933, Hitler is running for office, right? This is a decisive moment in German history. What does Hitler say about the famine in Soviet Ukraine? This is very telling. What does he say to tens of thousands of people in the Sportpalast in Berlin? He says, a country which could be the breadbasket for the entire world is being made to suffer this terrible famine. Now, the crucial thing about this is the idea that Ukraine could be the breadbasket for the entire world, because that reveals the essence of the Nazi project. Now, I'm not going to claim, and this is not the point at all, that the Nazi project is the same as the Soviet project. What I want to claim is that both of them are essentially about world history. They're both about remaking the world in a certain way. What Hitler is after is not authoritarianism in Germany or nationalism in Germany or a stronger German state. Hitler is after a remaking of the world. The logic is not a class struggle as in the Soviet Union. The logic is a racial struggle. The idea is that Germany is going to fight a war in the East which unleashes a natural racial struggle in which the Germans will redeem themselves, will inevitably triumph, and will take the land that they need. Now, the crucial part about this, operationally, is that the land that they need is Ukraine. Hitler is very specific about this from Mein Kampf forward. Ukraine is the territory which is going to set Germany free. Ukraine is the territory which is going to make Germany autarkic, self-sufficient. Ukraine is the territory which is going to turn Germany into a great power. Ukraine is the territory where Germans are going to prove their racial superiority. Just as Ukraine is crucial for the Soviet project, so Ukraine is crucial for the German project. And both of these are projects that are not national. Both of these are projects about the transformation of the world. And with this, just as Stalin speaks of a kind of internal colonization, Hitler speaks very explicitly of external colonization. He speaks of colonization in a way, it would be wrong to call it old-fashioned. It was actually more dramatic than the colonial rhetoric of the 19th century. When Hitler talks about Ukrainians, he says, what we're... Are you going to stay? Okay, good. So when Hitler talks about Ukrainians, I mean, of course, there's the general idea of Untermenschen. There's the general idea that Slavs are racially inferior. But in particular, with respect to Ukrainians, he says, what we will do is we will give them beads or other objects that colonial peoples like. He says, what we will do is we will hang a single loudspeaker from a post in the middle of the village, and the Ukrainians can dance around that post once a week, and therefore they will be happy, right? This gives you, these are not meant as jokes, this is how he understood what colonial rule was like. And his proposition was that this would work, the beads and the dancing, after most of the population had been starved out or enslaved, right? So the vision of colonization is extremely radical. Now, this connects with something else which is extremely important. It connects, it connects, the vision most obviously connects with Soviet rule, like where Stalin had a 5-year plan, the Germans are going to have a 4-year plan, where Stalinist policy led to 3 million deaths. The hunger plan, the German hunger plan envisioned that 30 million people would be starved to death in the first winter of the war in 1941. Where Stalin implemented collectivization, Hitler's planners imagined that the collective farm would be kept for the same purposes, right? The idea was that the collective farm, instead of sending grain north and west, the collective farm would send, north and east, the collective farm would send grain to the west, to Germany. There's going to be this massive diversion of the fruit of the Ukrainian soil to the west. Those are the most obvious links, but there's another link which I want to make sure that you see, because it seems to me that it's very important. And that is the link between Ukraine as a colony and the Holocaust. If you look back in Mein Kampf, there are 2 basic levels of analysis. The first I've already mentioned, it's Lebensraum, the idea that Germans have a racial destiny, that superior races are going to grind down inferior races, that there should be a racial struggle for which Ukraine is the primary target. That is one level of analysis. Another level of analysis is about why this racial struggle isn't happening now, right? If the Germans are really so wonderful and everyone else is really so inferior, why haven't the Germans already taken what they should get, right? Hitler asked the question. And the answer that he gives is the Jews. So the Jews are the source, says Hitler, of all of the legal thinking, philosophical thinking, religious thinking, which stands in the way of the higher races taking what they need. So the Jews are responsible for the Soviet Union. They're responsible for communism. They're also responsible for Christianity, right? Hitler says that St. Paul and Trotsky are basically the same person. He refers to St. Paul as the political commissar of Christianity, right? And he means this literally. All of these ideas, whether it's law, the state, communism, socialism, contracts, whatever it might be, Christian mercy, all of them are Jewish products. Now, what does this mean? It means that in practice, the German war for the East, which begins in 1941, always has these 2 elements contained within it. It is always going to be a war of conquest against the people regarded as racially inferior, And at the same time, it always must be simultaneously a war of extermination against the Jews who will prevent the Germans from winning. And so in this respect, Ukraine also connects up to this attempt to change world history. That is, it connects up to this attempt to remake the world. Because what Hitler thinks he's doing when Operation Barbarossa begins is he believes he's simultaneously going to create a colony for the Germans and strike a first blow against what he sees as the Jewish international conspiracy. So what I'm trying to claim here, you already see what I'm trying to claim. What I'm trying to claim here is not something like the Holocaust and the Holodomor are the same thing. They're not the same thing. What I'm trying to work against is the notion that you can see either one of them only as national history, right? I do not think one can understand the Holodomor without some broader framework. I do not think one can understand the Holocaust without some broader framework. And I would go so far as to say that they both make more sense if you can find some European or global framework to put them together inside. So or to be very specific about this, what I think is totally impermissible and ahistorical is to use one of them to cancel the other out, right, in any form. And what I think makes no sense is to put the two of them side by side and treat them as competitors. What makes more sense is to try to find some historical framework in which both of them make historical sense. And what I want to submit to you is that any historical framework in which one of them makes sense is also going to be a historical framework in which the other one of them makes sense. And until we find that historical framework, we have to keep on working. Okay, now, that's the main case that I wanted to make. If this argument is true, what would it tell us about the present? These are the remarks that I want to leave you with. What would it tell us about our own moment in time, which I'm going to somewhat pretentiously call the second globalization? I don't know why I find that so attractive. I do know why. The reason is that it's important to see globalization in historical terms. It's important to see that globalization can go wrong, right? In the 1880s and 1890s, people like us, as it were, people generally thought that globalization was going in a good way. Globalization meant the inevitable triumph of capitalism or of liberalism or of socialism, but it certainly meant something good. That was the general view in the 1880s and the 1890s, right? Those are the decades to which we owe the idea of progress, for example, right? Or of determinism. Those are the decades when it seemed like things were going to go very well. That globalization collapsed. And the reason why I'd like to speak of a second globalization today is that I think it's very important for us to understand that our globalization is not some flat ahistorical inevitability, but also something which can rise and which can fall. And whether it does rise or fall depends largely on us. And the thought that I want to leave you with is that in particular, it depends to a great extent on how we think about Ukraine and what we do about Ukraine. Okay, that's a big idea. Let me try to explain it. If the first globalization was an imperial one, the second one is a post-imperial one. If the first one was colonial, the second one was post-colonial. If we consider Europe, okay, let's consider Europe, and let's do it globally, not in terms of European national ideas about themselves, which are all a little bit silly. Okay, so one silly European self-understanding is the idea that Europeans learned something from the Second World War. Why do they say this? I'll tell you why they say it, because then they can say, Americans didn't learn anything from the Second World War, right? And of course we didn't. I mean, of course we did. You don't lose from wars that you win. You don't learn from wars that you win, you only learn from wars that you lose. Europeans didn't learn anything from the Second World War. What Europeans learned something from were colonial wars that they lost, okay? Europeans learned from colonial wars that they lost. The whole business of Europeans learning from the Second World War, oh, you're back. That's nice. I'm not going to summarize it for you, though, because these people have been really patient. They've been paying a lot of attention, most of them. So where was I? Okay, so Europeans do not learn from the Second World War. This is something we have to separate ourselves from. This is like the official myth of the European Union. It's almost as official as like the Ode to Joy. Like you have to believe it, in fact. And when I give this lecture in some form to European bureaucrats, it's always a lot of good fun because they've been raised from birth to think that they learned something from the Second World War. What exactly it was, who knows, you know? But it's not true, I'm here to tell you. What the Europeans learned from were the colonial wars that they lost. The only sense in which Europeans learned something from the Second World War is that Germany learned from a colonial war that it lost. Okay? That was the war for Ukraine. Germany learned from that war, right? Germany then begins this project of European integration with France and Benelux after it loses its colonial war. And when other European nations lose colonial wars, France in North Africa and Indonesia, right? The Netherlands, right? The Spanish and the Portuguese in Africa, eventually even the British, when they lose their imperial wars, Europe is the place for them to go to. Okay, now the point of all this is not to be iconoclastic. The point is to understand a certain basic structure. Europe is the home that European states have after imperialism fails. That is what, you can never say the true thing about yourself, right? There's my little psychoanalytic moment. You can never say the true thing about yourself. National memory always must exclude the basic truth. That's what historians are for. Historians are to say that thing. And the thing that I'm trying to say is that the European Union is where you go after empire fails. What's interesting about this is that it turns out to be true whether you were an imperial power or whether you were part of someone else's empire. Okay? So when I look at the European Union enlargements of 2004 and 2007, I do not see like, oh look, those nice East Europeans finally got to join the West. That's a nice story. But the more important story is states that used to be part of someone else's empire joined into an entity with states that used to have an empire. And the unbelievable achievement of the European Union is that it managed to bring two states with very different kinds of histories together without anyone even noticing that this was happening, okay? So the European Union turns out to be a kind of reservoir. It turns out to be a place where you go from your post-imperial history, whatever side of post-imperial history you were on. Now, why is Ukraine so central? I'm sure you've already figured out what I'm going to say now. The European Union is important for nation states in Europe because otherwise there are no nation states in Europe, okay? So this is another very important myth. Everyone has their history organized nationally. But in fact, national history doesn't really make any sense because the nation state never really exists. You can create a nation state, but very soon, and you can just look for counterexamples, right after you create it, you'll have a world war, probably two, right? Even the Germans couldn't create a nation state, right? They created one in 1871, First World War, Second World War, division of Germany, and when Germany emerges unified, it's inside the European Union, not a fully sovereign state. There is no history of the German nation state. It basically never happened. Even when it did exist, it was dominated by Prussia, right? It didn't happen. It's a myth. There is no moment of the European nation state, and I would venture to say there never will be such a moment. The European Union makes the myth of the nation state possible by making the nation state possible. The European Union makes places like Slovakia possible, okay? And no particular offense is meant to Slovaks. It makes places like Germany possible, I'm trying to say. It's what makes the European state possible. And this is what Ukrainians on the Maidan in the end of 2013 quite correctly understood, right? The attempt to move to Europe, the attempt to move Ukraine towards Europe was simultaneously an attempt to preserve, save, rescue, reform the Ukrainian state, right? Ukrainian young people quite correctly understood this case that I've taken an hour to make, which is that you need Europe to have a Ukrainian state. The thing is that the converse is also true. In order for Europe to exist, it has to be attractive to states beyond its borders. Insofar as the European Union exists and is thriving, it must be attractive to states to its east, or for that matter, to its south. If it ceases to be attractive, that means it has ceased to exist. So insofar as Europe exists, Ukrainians are going to want it as a way precisely to secure the Ukrainian state. And insofar as Europe exists, it's going to be attractive outside the European state. Which brings us to, of course, the point that I want to make, right? Europe must enlarge or die. And I don't want to be too dramatic about Ukraine, right? The national anthem already has it, but Ukraine must, let's say, Europeanize, right? You must Europeanize over the long run in order to be a state. That's not specific to Ukraine. It's true of everyone. Ukraine just happens to be the case. I mean, I would say from the medieval period up to the present, it happens to be the place where the basic lessons of European history are most explicit, or if you like, most painfully evident. And in this case, the lesson is, if you want to be a state, you need to have Europe. Okay. Now, and this is the very last thing that I want to say. What does this mean for the Ukrainian, Russian conflict. And the implication is, of course, very straightforward. The Russian intervention in Crimea or the Donbass is not and was never only about Ukraine. It was about stopping a process of Ukrainian Europeanization, or stopping a process of Europeanization generally. It goes along, if you only pay attention to Ukrainian affairs, then you notice the Russian troops in Crimea, you notice the Russian troops in the Donbass, but you might not notice that simultaneously Russia's investing in the European far right, and that Russia's investing generally in propaganda efforts to bring down the European Union. It is all one policy, right? The way that the second globalization has worked out in Europe so far is that post-imperial states of one kind or another kind have come together. That is a process which allows for sovereignty. It's a process which allows for democracy. It's a process which allows for prosperity. That process is being resisted, not just in Ukraine, but in Europe, and if you like, and I think it's fair to say, also globally. So this means, what does this mean? This means that if you read Sputnik, or watch it, which I presume that none of you do, so I'll tell you what it says. If you read Sputnik or watch it, you will see that on the 18th of October, there was a specific denial, which is something rather new in Sputnik, of the truth of the Holodomor. There was a specific denial that the Holodomor ever happened. It was presented as a Nazi hoax, which is moving us way back to the era of Soviet propaganda, right? The idea that there was no famine, that this in fact is a hoax, and that this hoax was a Nazi hoax is something that we haven't heard for a long time. That's more dramatic than Russian propaganda has been up to this point. Now, of course, you can say this is an atrocity from the point of view of the memory of those who died, and I think that's always true. When one denies the reality of an event in which millions of people suffer and die, that is a certain kind of intellectual and moral atrocity. You can say this is a falsehood directed against Ukrainian history, and of course that would also be true. Ukrainian history simply does not make any sense without some interpretation of the first five-year plan and of the deliberate political famine which took place in the borders of Soviet Ukraine. My case, though, is that if you deny, those two cases are important and very real, but my case is an additional one. My case is that that kind of propaganda against the historical event is also an attempt to break down the history of Europe itself. It's also an attempt to break down the history of the world without an understanding of the Holodomor, or without an understanding of Ukraine inside projects of colonization or of neo-globalization. Without those events, European history also doesn't make any sense. And I would go so far as to say, without those events, if those events are somehow bracketed or treated as controversial or doubtful, right? If they're somehow removed from our field of view, then you can't put world history back together again, right? So the violence that is done, by this kind of claim is not just violence to people who can no longer defend themselves. It's not just violence to a sense of national coherence in history. It's also violence to our ability to put world history together. That's where I wanted to leave you. Thank you very much.
Now, we want to assure that you all have time to purchase a book about the Holodomor and purchase one of Professor Snyder's books before you leave. He will be willing to sign those books later, so we're going to have plenty of time for that. Indeed, we won't let any of you out without at least one book in your hands, so you're in for the evening. However, I think he would agree that we have some time for questions, and I use that word advisedly. So if you would make them relatively short, since I'm sure we will have quite a few people who would like to speak, Mr. Deshko, and then Andriy Vinitsky, I see already.
You made the very good argument that European states learn from their mistakes in post-colonization. What does Russia learn from the collapse of the Soviet Union and from the near collapse of the Russian Federation where it's heading right now?
Well, so we don't know yet. Okay, so what's interesting, I mean, if you look at the framework, there are two things that are special about Russia. Russia, like the United States and China, is very big. And so when it loses a little colonial war, it's like the first Chechen war, it doesn't have the same kind of significance as, for example, when the Netherlands or France loses a war. That forces, I think, a more dramatic confrontation with one's own history. Russia's a big, it's a big land empire, if you like, or it's a state where their colonies are on the margins. That's different. The second point would be that you simply don't have the same kind of, it's not the same kind of trauma. In fact, in a way, it's the reverse, because the Soviet Union, let's remember, falls apart without much bloodshed, which is different from, French Southeast Asia, right? It's different from Kashmir. It's different from the way that empires usually fall apart. And so, if you like, the lesson is actually not, this is terrible, but the lesson is actually not there. It's not there to be learned, because it's not as though a Russian army fought valiantly against Baltic and then Ukrainian and then Caucasian independence movements. That never happened, right? The Soviet Union fell apart in an entirely different way and for entirely different reasons, and consensually. And precisely because, I'm not wishing bloody wars on anyone, but for that reason, it's I think easier to revise what that history was all about, which is happening before our eyes. So that what's happening instead is, I think, the reverse. So you ask what's being learned. What's happening instead is that the late history of the Soviet Union is being revised in such a way as to make it look like a Russian national history where Russia was betrayed by Ukrainians and Belarusians and Balts, but also by the West. That's where things are going now. What I do not wish upon Russia is that Russia must suffer that kind of defeat. I do not wish that upon Russia, and I do not wish that upon whoever Russia would be fighting at the time. I hope this can go some different direction.
Happily, the Sputnik report that you mentioned was carried towards people like, say, me and others in Italian by a daily beast thing where it quoted it directly. It related that thesis directly back to Douglas Toddle's Famine and Fascism, the standard issue Soviet attack that was essentially
Loudly,
an
please.
outgrowth of memorializing the Holodomor, and they responded by demonizing the West. But anyway, what perplexed me was when you said that the Soviet leadership nationalized the Holodomor. Was that every single other narrative, Soviet or non-Soviet, about the Holodomor was to deny that. So exactly when did they make a decision to both do something and lie about it? How do you see that? That's where you ended in a way. You're saying, with this example, that certain states attack the very notion of historical coherence. And so I was wondering where you saw the regime making that decision to both nationalize and to lie about it.
Well, it's the same decision. It's the same moment. The moment of action is the moment of mendacity. There's no division between the two. In August of, I can give you a couple of dates if you want, but in August of 1932, when Stalin says, we can lose Ukraine, right? This is a moment of identifying the problem as a national one, which of course then requires a national response, or if you like, to be more technical about it, a Soviet Republic level response, which in fact is then implemented in November, December, January, February of 32 and 33. But the moment when Stalin says we can lose Ukraine is a moment where what is in fact a general Soviet crisis, that is, the collectivization fails everywhere. It just fails more dramatically where more is expected of it, right? In Ukraine, much more is expected of it. At that moment, it becomes national. When Stalin, in succeeding, actually it starts in June, but when Stalin, starting in June and moving through the fall of 1932, identifies the problem as being Ukrainian communists who are in fact nationalists, who have in fact been recruited by the Polish secret services, that is a nationalization which then serves as a justification for the policy, right? It's not that it's true, it's a lie from the beginning, but the lie and the policy are the same thing. Or to give you another date, the Party Congress of January 1934, when Kaganovich says that Stalin's revolution is the greatest revolution of all time, including Lenin's revolution, that is the moment where collectivization is declared to be a great success, and all of its enemies are declared to have been vanquished, including the enemies who were defined as Ukrainian, right? So I get the question, but I think like in Soviet practice, the lie and the policy are very often the same thing. The lie starts with the policy, and the policy starts with the lie, and then it's disentangling them, which becomes the exercise of, you know, conservative or liberal bourgeois empirist historians, right, such as myself. But you have to understand, I mean, one has to understand that in that world, they come together. Now, did I get to your question, or was there a second part to it?
No, essentially, what you'll get is, as a reaction to this lecture, is a sense of, well, finally somebody's getting it, and good luck telling the world what we know.
Thank you. Thank you. I can use all the good wishes I can get.
Being at the vanguard of telling the rest of the English and European and other world that this is the way one should see it.
But history, all of
An incredible amount of resistance.
all of history is like that. I mean, you'd be like, it's the Holodomor is a particularly difficult case, and you know, I'm not taking like I'm not taking a briefcase full of like, you know, whatever Ukrainian thinks and like going out to the world with it. Like I sort of make my own argument about how it happened. But what I would say is that all history is like this. There just is no history where, you know, everyone actually understands it, especially in Eastern Europe, right? I mean, especially in Eastern Europe. So anyway, you see my point. Like, this is just what history is like. You're always working against the grain somehow. So. Which is why I appreciate the good wishes.
Yes, please.
But I think in Ukraine, Ukrainians have understood this for a very long time, and their frustration with the West has been, why has the West not gotten this yet? So I think sort of to go further with that question is, why is it so difficult for others to grasp this?
I guess I have to disagree. So when you say the Ukrainians have understood this, I don't know what you mean by this, because I know a lot of Ukrainians, and I've been talking about them, in Ukrainian about the Holodomor for 20 years, and it is the case that there's very strong family memory. It is the case increasingly that there's a sense of national identification with the tragedy, but you cannot. I mean, let me put this a different way. If you stop a Jew on the street in Tel Aviv and say, how did the Holocaust happen? You actually don't get a very good answer. If you stop a Ukrainian on the street in Ivano-Frankivsk and say how the Holodomor happened, you do not actually get a very good answer. They know that there was such a thing. They may have some connection to it, but the this is very important, because the this that I'm trying to present is a historical argument that fits into other historical arguments, right? Which in a way goes to the heart of the question. Because no one in Los Angeles or Singapore is ever going to understand the Holodomor as a Ukrainian family tragedy, or as part of a Ukrainian nation-building exercise, or even as Ukrainian national history. It can only be understood insofar as it fits into larger, more universal processes that other people have. And so this is where I guess I have to disagree, at least about what the this is. I do not think that Ukrainians for decades have had a way of presenting the Holodomor so that it fits into other things. I mean, this is something that, Frank's projects, where is Frank? Oh, right there. This is something that the recent work of these projects addresses, and it's something I tried to do in Bloodlines. But I mean, I have to really work against this. Like the Poles say the same thing. They say, oh yes, but we've understood. No, it's actually not that simple. To know that Katyn happened, I'm just going to switch nations on you again. To know that Katyn happened is not the same thing as knowing why, and it's not the same thing as presenting it in some kind of larger framework like the destruction of political elites or the destruction of states, which other people can understand. So it's actually not that like I'm some kind of football player carrying like a Ukrainian football, into the like massed lines of Western resistance. That will never work, right? There has to be some other way of getting it across. So the frustration narrative, I think you have to be very careful about, because it goes on forever. You'll always be frustrated.
But you just said that they understood that they need in Maidan that they needed to move towards the European Union. There is an
Okay, if we're going to say, yes, yeah, yes. I would just want to, we just have to be very careful about saying like inside, so this is in a way like, if I'm wrong about this, I should resign from being a historian, but I think we have to be very careful about saying that we understand, that any nation understands something, and the problem is getting that message out. Everybody says that, okay? Even Americans say that, God help us. Everyone says that, and it can't be true. The problem has to be of finding the thing which actually connects this experience with some other experience, and that's why I'm making this whole pitch for European history or for world history. Not just because I think it's true, but because I think it's comprehensible, right? Because I think it's a way of getting out, of solving this problem,
Now, is this argument going
Stand
to
up and loud.
now, is this argument going to be fleshed out in your next book? Is it something that you prepared only for this particular lecture, or actually you're working on something larger that would be presented to more than just this audience?
I would like for you all to believe that you're special. I'm thinking about a short book about Maidan and about the war, which would not be a contemporary history, but which would be a kind of book of political theory, where I look at certain problems like propaganda, like annexation, like civil society, and try to unpack what has happened to Europe in the last few years. Not narrating it step by step, but like looking at some key concepts. And one of the concepts is history. So if I'm smart enough to write this book, the first chapter will be some kind of presentation of European history, which is a little bit like the way I'm talking about. And the argument is that not only Ukrainians on the Maidan, where I completely agree, but also Russian elites understand Europe in something like this way. And so the very reason why young Ukrainians want to move Ukraine towards Europe is the reason why the Russian foreign policy elite understands they have to destroy it. They have the same historical understanding, they just draw different conclusions about it. Anyway, I'm thinking these things through, hopefully, with the eye towards writing a little book.
Gentleman here. Yes, please. Stand up, please. And, okay.
I read Bloodlines, and I've read a number of things you've written. I'm just wondering what weight you give to the individual differences between leaders. How important is it that somebody like Hitler is in power, or Mao's in power, or I don't want to get a laugh out of this, but Harvard is in power, and what kind of weight you give to just the actual personalities that are in place?
No, thank you. It's a really important question because there's a tendency, so when social history got the wind in its sails in the 1970s, there was a certain tendency to claim that individuals didn't really matter, even at the very top. And, sorry. So there's in the 70s and even into the 80s, when social history was dominating, there was a tendency to say that individuals couldn't matter, and it's still like you still get the criticism. I mean, as I do, like on a regular basis. Happily, it's the only criticism I ever get. That there's a great man. Like if you mention any individual, you fall on prey to the great man theory of history, right? That if you start from Hitler or start from Stalin, I'll walk up and stand next to you. That if you start from Hitler and start from Stalin, you fall victim to this great man theory. I do think that personalities matter, but of course you have to explain how the personality gets to a position of power, and you have to explain how that personality's ideas actually work as politics. I assign probably more weight to it than many of my colleagues do, but when you do that, you're actually setting a kind of trap for yourself, because you then have to explain how could someone with these ideas or with that personality actually work. You make the history very hard to write, but that's, I think, the price that you pay for trying to get it correct.
Maybe I'll take prerogative chair because I'm following up. Prerogative chair means you have to think of one question if you're running it in case something, but I think this is the time to do it. When the recent events occurred in the Maidan, a German language wrote me an email saying, Frank, I guess you and the Galicians were right about the Russians. That is, the shock that Russians were doing what they were doing. So I wonder, moving from the Hitler and Stalin, you have to have, to a degree, a receptive public. You have to sell an idea then that you're going to find resonance in, or, as we've seen in Putin, great success. Many are shocked at how easy it was for him to stir up public opinion. So how much weight do you put on that part then? That is, their reception and resonance in their societies for accepting either a colonial policy towards the east in the German place, or an anti-Ukrainian policy in Stalin selling to, as part of the Soviet, pretty Russian population.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me say three things, and I say them with the qualification that I think to have any kind of confidence about this sort of thing, one would have to be living inside Russia and paying a great deal of attention, which I'm not doing. So, with that qualification, three things. The first is that we have to remember that all empires go through periods of trauma, and in that sense, Russia is not unusual. And so I hesitate before making a special case of Russia in this setting. When we remember that all of the nice European countries where we like to go, right, on vacation, all of those nice European countries also had imperial wars, which were a lot bloodier than the ones that Russia thus far has led. It helps us to keep this in perspective, that it is normal for there to be some kind of post-imperial trauma. That's normal. What shape it takes, of course, depends upon leaders and other factors, but it's normal. I'm not saying it's okay or that it's good or that I don't want it to end. I'm just saying that it's historically, it would be unusual if the Russian Federation simply accepted its borders and said everything is fine. The second thing is that Russia, unlike Britain, and even unlike France, although France is a closer case, does not know where the country ends in the empire. This is a very old argument. It doesn't know where the country ends in the empire starts because it's a land empire, right? And so therefore, it's not so surprising that many Russians don't take the borders of the Russian Federation that seriously. Having a land empire, and America was like this, until we found oceans, until we gave up on Canada. I hadn't even made the joke yet, and you were already laughing, so I'll just save the joke for later. It has to do with global warming. It's not so surprising that there would be this motion. There would be this sort of uncertainty. But okay, so now the third thing, the things that have to do with leaders that are contingent. With the case of the contemporary Russian Federation, I will now make a point which I imagine you might agree with, although many people find it very surprising. We're in a moment of Russian nation formation. Okay, so the end of empire is also the moment of nation formation. It's not that you have nations who have empires and then you lose the empire and you have a nation. Like, it's not like getting divorced, right? It's not like there's you and then there's your wife and then there's you again and you cry. There was never you in the first place, right? So nations don't have empires. That's not how it happens. The age of empire happened before there were nations. You see? There was no Russian nation when the Russian Empire was created. There just wasn't. There was a bunch of Swedes and Germans and, Poles, what have you. But there was no Russian nation then. And just like there was no Ukrainian nation then, with apologies. There weren't nations in the age of empire. When empires fall apart, then nations are made, not just at the peripheries, but also at the center, right? So, England is a nation in formation right now before our eyes, right? The English are deciding who they are and who they're not. Before our eyes, that's happening. And it's happening with the Russians as well. And so this doesn't give you an answer, but I think it's one of the basic questions is, how is the Russian nation being formed? Because we have this habit, maybe not you, but in general, there's this habit in the West of looking at this and saying, oh, well, like Russia's been there forever, and the Ukrainians, they were invented last week. But the Russians and the Ukrainians are being invented at the same time. As I see it, they've both had states for 25 years, and they're both having a pretty shaky time of figuring out who they are. If anything, the Ukrainians, and this is now my really, okay, in this room, totally normal, but outside of this room in the real world, where the wolves howl, really abnormal view. The Ukrainian nation formation is actually further along than Russian nation formation, because Russian nation formation is very much about who one is not, right? So right now, a Russian is the only person in the world who says there's no such thing as Ukraine. That's not enough, right? We say there's no such, okay, I'm gonna stop it with the Canada jokes, I'm really sorry. But when we forget that Canada exists, okay, so Canada doesn't exist in the United States, it's not, but that's not the only thing we have to say about ourselves. You can't just define yourself against the non-existence of something else, right? And so much of Russian national formation is happening, and now I'm getting closer to your question, is happening by the denial that other things exist. And so the war in Ukraine is a war over a place which is thought not to exist, right? You can't get very far that way, and that's in a way why you have to move from Ukraine to Syria. You have to, and this is the final part. One of the things which is specific about Russian nation formation is the television, that it all happens abroad, and it all happens by way of a visual medium, and it all happens by way of Russia projecting itself in some other part of the world. That, I don't know how long that can actually last, and I think it might be much more fragile. So when I try to look at this from a Russian point of view as often as possible. I don't know where you go after Syria to continue this sort of thing. I just don't know where you go. I don't know how long it can last.
So this gentleman, and then this gentleman in the back, and Professor Darevich, and I think with that, yeah, okay, let's see, I'll go with this.
The general gist I get from the recent history is that lies are very important. And obviously the Russians think so because they spend billions of dollars on lies. And other people are spending a lot less trying to tell the truth. What is the importance of massive lying in present day history?
So I think that's a magnificent question to which I'm going to give no doubt unsatisfactory answer. The first part of my answer has to do with media, that it is the dominance of visual media makes the big lie much easier than it was before, because the way that pictures work in our brain is simply different than the way that words work. If I can get you, not you personally, anyone in front of an image with an association to that image, if I can give you a horrible image of carnage and then put like Ukrainian fascists next to that image, it is, and this is stuff that we've done laboratory work on. It is very hard then to undo that image, right? You can then read 1,000 books by, you can then read 1,000 articles by people about how maybe they weren't fascists, or maybe they weren't Ukrainians, or maybe that picture was from 1965. But the initial impact of the image is still there. A lot of the lying that you're talking about is visual lying, where pictures are deliberately put in a different context. And since what so many of us now do is get images first and then words later, that kind of lying is extremely effective and hard to undo. Not impossible, but hard. That's my first answer. The second answer is that I'm not so much concerned by the lying as I am by the big lie, or by the attempt to create a different fabric of reality, the alternative reality, or what Hannah Arendt called a fictional world. So, so everybody, governments lie. Like they lie here and there. They lie about this or that. Sometimes they get caught. That's one thing, the kind of empirical lie, right? And it's another thing when you actually try to build up a whole theater and then have people play roles on the theater. And that's what disturbed me about the Ukrainian war so much, is that not that the Russians, not the particular claim that they're all fascist, but that they're all fascists is part of this whole alternative fabric of reality, right? And then people are invited into that reality, and some people come into that reality, as far away as New York or Berlin. And that's what concerns me the most. Is that it maybe has turned out to be less effective than I thought it was a year ago, because if you actually look at the public opinion polling, the Germans and the Americans are much more skeptical about Russia than they were a year ago. But it's the big lying, it's the fabrication of alternative realities which has got me concerned. And in short, it's very important. It's very important, but I'm not sure you can win with it over the long run. Right? I'm less afraid. So RT seemed more sinister to me a year ago than it does now. But the way that it seems sinister is not the everyday line, it's like the fabrication of the whole picture.
This gentleman.
Sir, your speech was absolutely excellent and totally amazing to me. There was not a word of which I could disagree.
A word of what? Sorry, sir?
Please stand up when you
Okay,
speak.
your speech was absolutely excellent and amazingly for me. There was not a word with which I could disagree. Now, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, as nearly all of us know, included Belarus, and the official language was
So, yeah, my world is a little. I'm glad that you agree with everything. That's, I mean, I was sort of like, usually that kind of introduction is a lead into a totally devastating question. So in this case, I guess what I would start with, in a way, the underlying premise, which you made explicit at the end, the idea of returning to a past, because I think that the past is a little bit mushier than it might seem at first glance. So that there was something called Belarusian, which was the official language of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. There was something called Chancery Slavonic, which comes from OCS, which was one of my minor research languages, Frank. So Church Slavonic, Chancery Slavonic, and then Chancery Slavonic goes to the Grand Duchy, and then it becomes vernacularized. I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but it takes in, vernacular Belarusian words. But the court language and the language of the law, which I just find fascinating, is Chancery Slavonic. It's not vernacular Belarusian. I mean, it becomes closer to vernacular, but it's not actually vernacular Belarusian or the Ruthenian or whatever that's spoken in Belarus. It's not exactly the same thing. And no one's gonna. And so I'm gonna make a prediction, which is the thing that they pay us not to do. No one's gonna go back to Chancery Slavonic. It's not going to happen. And so, I mean, that is a pars pro totem. I don't think that you go back to history. I don't think that Ukraine has gone back to history. I think that history is always moving forward in unpredictable ways. The past serves as inspiration in surprising ways. One of the things I find so interesting about the Maidan is that although we obsess, we Galicians and people who love them, we obsess about the Second World War and the divided memory of the Second World War. That was actually not so important in 2013, 2014, 2015. And the way I read it, I could be wrong, is that the Maidan and also the war was much, like the war itself, it's a simple argument, but I think it's right. The war itself was much more important than the memory of war. And the revolution itself was much more important than any memory of revolution. And that the discovery of Ukraine, I looked for Europe and I found Ukraine. The discovery of Ukraine isn't necessarily a historical one. Like, it's historical in the sense that historians look at it and say, aha, this is something interesting. But it need not be a return to anything. And with language, here I'm skeptical about language. I'm skeptical about the need for language. I like Ukrainian, I speak Ukrainian. I speak it when I'm in Dnipropetrovsk because it's just so much better than my Russian. But I don't actually, I like the way Ukrainian works in Ukraine. I like the bilinguality of it. I like the different registers. I like the way people contextualize. I like that there's a language of politics. I think that's really interesting. But I don't think that there has to be a language for there to be a nation, right? And as an American, I have to think that because we only have 3/4 of a language ourselves, and we make do with that, right? And we're definitely a nation. I mean, if anybody's a nation, it's us, right? And we do not have our own language. We just don't, and neither do you, for that matter. And you're a nation, right? I mean, these are just banal things. So I don't believe that. So for Belarus, it's the same. I mean, I like that there are now cafes in Minsk where the unwritten rule is you speak Belarusian. I think that's really cool. I like that Viktor Martinovich wrote his second novel in Belarusian. I think that's really interesting. I think it's interesting, that even Lukashenko, right, is starting to give more public addresses in the Belarusian. I think that's all very interesting. Like, these have political connotations. They're meant to. But I don't think that for there to be a Belarusian nation, everyone has to start speaking Belarusian again. That might happen at some point, but I don't think I think you don't need it for the Belarusian nation. My basic answer to your question is, my sense is that Belarusian society is actually much more defined as such than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And that it's not that, I do not think that Belarusians are assimilated into Russian society. I think that view would be vastly, vastly overstated. I think a lot of Belarusians are in a position that a lot of Ukrainians in the East were before 2013. They don't want to be forced to make a choice. Right? They don't want to be forced to make it. Well, I think it's a perfectly human and understandable attitude. But that said, I think that Belarusian society is quite distinct and more distinct all the time. And the Belarusian leadership, which one does not have to love, and I'm not recommending that one love it, but the Belarusian leadership is also distinctively Belarusian, right? I mean, the people who run that country have a particular understanding of their own interests, of course, but their interests are Belarusian interests and not Russian ones.
I'm going to ask you to make a prediction.
But I just made one.
It has to do with the project, the Ukrainian project, of trying to get into Europe. I'd like you to make a prediction on whether that will be successful, and secondly, is it really worthwhile? I mean, the Ukrainians, I think, have this naive idea that if they get into Europe, everything is hunky-dory. That is, we'll be safe against all these terrible Russians and stuff like that. But they've already had experience with the Budapest Club. What is your opinion? How is this going to end?
No, I mean, I only make one prediction per lecture, and Chancellor Slavonic was it. No, I mean, I made two predictions about Ukraine. Let's see, what were they? I predicted that Russia would invade Ukraine, and I predicted that in the New York Times. And that was, I mean, at the time, basically everyone said that I was crazy, and the people who edited the article made me scale it way back from what I wanted to say. But I was right. And here's the thing about predictions. It doesn't pay to be right at all. No, it's true. If you're correct in making a prediction, no one notices or no one cares, because all the people who did not make the prediction want to take cover, basically. So when I wrote that piece in the New York Times, lots of people wrote me and told me I was crazy. But when Russia did invade Ukraine, how many of my colleagues wrote me and said, oh yeah, you were right? One. Right? One, exactly. The second prediction I made was that Putin would rehabilitate the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a prediction that I made in May of 2014. That turned out to be right. I really want to rest on my laurels. is what I'm trying to say. The two remarks I would make with respect to this are, first, that I think Ukrainians are not as naive as you're making them out to be. I think that view that Europe is going to save us is not so very widely held. I mean, the way that, I mean, I think the notion that we want an association agreement to go after local corruption was pretty hard-headed, right? Was pretty hard-headed and historically informed, to go back to your point. I don't think it's the same thing as believing that Europe is going to come and save us. And if anyone thought that, a year and a half ago, they probably don't think that now. What I find instead is that most people think that, Europe is a worthwhile long-term goal. And also, I mean, from Europeans say, I hear Europeans say, the Ukrainians think we're going to let them in 3 years or 5 years, and we're so worried that I don't think Ukrainians think that they're going to join the European Union in 3 years or 5 years. I think Ukrainians understand perfectly well that if it happens at all, it's going to be a really, really long-term process. I just don't see that level of, of unsophistication in Ukraine. The second point I'm going to make is that Ukraine will join the European Union, not because Ukraine wants to, but because Europe wants it to happen. Joining the European Union is not something that you do because you want to do it. It will only happen when it seems inevitable, when it seems normal. Like the moment it will happen will be the moment when Europeans say, oh yeah, look, there's a state which has the rule of law and a big market, and it has agricultural exports. That's really interesting, and a young, educated population. All of those things being true now, except for the rule of law, right? Which is my point. It will happen when Europeans look at Ukraine and say, aha, that's a normal country. And getting that to be true is, of course, not just a matter of correcting European perceptions. One can correct European perceptions about Ukraine not being a nation. One can correct Ukrainian perceptions about Ukrainian history, right? But the business about the rule of law is 100% true, and we all know it. So the moment when Ukraine joins the European Union is going to be the moment when Europeans say, hey, why isn't this rule of law state with a big market in with us? That'll be the moment when it happens.
So we now have historian as soothsayer. We know when things get really hard for us. Now, I want to make sure
Sorry.
the books. Professor Snyder has kindly agreed to sign them, so you can return with them. I also want to point out that big concepts can only exist if a lot of microhistory goes on. The two are closely connected. The Holodomor Research and Education Consortium is trying to do a lot of microhistory as well as big things to try and provide material whom other historians then can look at and fit into concepts, and the two work in tandem. They go back and forth, and they make us look in new ways. We look forward to Professor Snyder advising us on projects in the future. We hope he will agree to return to Toronto for conferences and lectures we will have, and I'm sure that he will bring us many new ideas, and we can't go wider than the globe. I guess we go universal history next. That goes beyond our planet as well, but we will see where we go with that, and we thank him very much for like to talk to him, he will be near the book table signing. Make sure you come with at least